I'll make sure everything is showing and we should be ready to go. Okay, so we're going to do this slightly differently. Great. So based on what we see on a video conference, it appears there is a quorum, and the chair recognizes that a quorum is present and the investment committee meeting will come to order. I'd like to address a few housekeeping items for the meeting. Since it is not in person, we have muted all participants and listeners to avoid distractions. We appreciate your patience. If there arise any technical issues, please let us know. Please know that we're going to try everything we can to fix those as soon as we possibly can. So thank you for your patience, and we appreciate you participating with us today. Ashley Rendon will call the order of the members.
Chair Christopher Zook.
Here.
Keith Brainerd.
Here.
Sherry Shivers.
Here.
Great. Ashley is going to provide a list of people who pre-registered to provide comments, and when she calls your name, if you would please answer with present. And so Ashley, if you'll start there, please.
Thank you. There have been no members of the public who have pre-registered to provide comment today.
Okay. Is there anyone else who would like to provide comment at the end of the meeting who did not pre-register? If so, please provide your name and your topic that you'd like to comment on.
And I just wanted to know if there was anyone, they would need to press, since we muted everybody, they would need to press *6.
Thank you for that. *6 will give just a second, so that way everyone who wishes to register to comment can do so. Hearing none, we'll have a motion on this item, so please be sure if you're making the motion or seconding to first identify yourself. The chair entertains a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes.
Sherry, oh, go ahead.
Okay, the motion has been made by Mr. Brainerd, and Ms. Shivers, I can assume you'll be a second. Thank you for that. To suspend the reading of the minutes, is there any discussion for the committee or corrections of the minutes as they were circulated? Okay, so the motion has been made by Mr. Brainerd and seconded by Ms. Shivers to suspend the reading of the minutes. All in favor say aye.
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 And all opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and the minutes will not be read, and the minutes are approved as circulated. So at this time, we're going to dig into some pretty deep water in the case of these investment reports. We're going to talk about the investment practices and performance reports received as required by Government Code Section 802-109 from Senate Bill 322. So first, I'd like to ask Robert Munter and Kenny Herbold, as back and forth is required, to provide the report.
All right, thank you. So my name is Robert Munter. I'm the investment analyst here at the Texas Pension Review Board. I will be covering the majority of the information here and the presentation here today. So if we can go to the presentation, great. All right, so I'll be going over this preliminary report that we have on the investment practices and performance evaluations. If we can go to the next slide. All right, so just real quick, providing an overview here of the Senate Bill 322. So this is a requirement for public retirement systems with assets of at least 30 million to select an independent firm to conduct an evaluation, essentially assessing the adequacy and effectiveness of the retirement plan systems practices, and to ultimately make recommendations on improving on those policies and procedures and practices. Each of the evaluations must include the 5 below that were outlined in the presentation here. For anyone calling in, the 5 are the investment policy, the asset allocation, section on investment fees and commissions, section on governance processes, and finally, the investment manager selection and monitoring process. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so for the evaluations, the reports were due from the systems by June 1st of 2020. Per the PRB's records, 62 plans have assets of at least 30 million as of the fiscal year end immediately preceding the effective date, which was June 10th of 2019. So adjusting for the evaluations that include more than one plan, an example of this is that ERS's evaluation covers JRS and LECOS. We were expecting 55 evaluations. Two of the systems that, and as of today, the ones here that we have in the presentation, both of them have actually, as of this morning, provided their evaluations to us. So these are for Guadalupe Blanco River Authority and then for the Capital MTA plans. So both of these systems were below the 30 million level as of that effective date. And so they took it upon themselves to voluntarily have these evaluations conducted as they were close to that level. And again, they have both now provided them to us. And then of the evaluations received, 37 of them have been included in the analysis that we're going to be covering here today in the presentation. And this is because the majority of these evaluations were coming to us in late May and through early June. So we are still working on reviewing all of the evaluations here. So again, we will just be focusing on the 37 that we've had the time to review. If we can go to the next slide, please. So for the remaining evaluations that have not been submitted, all of the systems that we have here, we have been in contact with, and all of them have indicated that they are working with their consultants or the evaluators to get the evaluations to us as soon as possible. And we do understand that for these plans or the evaluators that they're working with, they can have been impacted by COVID-19. So we are working with them to help them however we can with completing this requirement. But if we can continue to the next slide. So first, what we want to just cover here as part of the evaluations is essentially the question of who conducted the evaluation. So what we've observed is that the majority of the evaluations were conducted by the investment consultants, as 30 of the evaluations were conducted by the existing investment consultant. We did see that there were 17 different independent firms that completed these evaluations, and then 7 of these evaluations were conducted by completely independent third parties. So again, the majority of these evaluations that we're seeing were conducted by the investment consultants for the systems. Now, that was fine because there was an exception as long as the investment consultant did not directly or indirectly have discretion over the investments. And these were things that generally was called out with the evaluations, that they were confirming that they don't have that discretion. If we can go to the next slide. So continuing with just sort of an overview of these evaluations, what we've seen is that for the evaluations, 20 of them have essentially not provided any form of recommendations for improvements that can be made after conducting their evaluation. And 17 of the evaluations did provide recommendations for improvement. And one interesting fact is that for all of the independent third parties that reviewed the systems, every single independent third party did identify at least one recommendation or one area for improvement that the systems could do. And this is I think it's important that we see these recommendations, and these 17 evaluations that have the recommendations is where we are primarily going to be focused on here today, as we think that it's going to be help provide a good understanding of generally what we're seeing across the evaluations, as well as providing examples for ways that systems can ultimately look to improve or areas that they should consider for improvement themselves if they didn't have anything from one of their own evaluations. If we continue to the next slide. So again, we're just going to provide a real quick sort of overview here for these. Focusing on, again, this is just now based off of the recommendations that we saw from those 17 evaluations. So what we did was, after we documented the recommendations, what we did was we reviewed each of the recommendations and we categorized them into categories that we thought would best match the intent of the recommendation. And for a number of the recommendations, there were no clear lines as to necessarily what category would fall in best, as some of the recommendations did cover multiple aspects of a system or were overly general. And some of the recommendations also covered areas that were not specific to the investment decision-making process. Now, we were also able to further divide the recommendations by subcategories to help understand a little bit better generally what the recommendations are being made. Again, some of these can easily fall into multiple subcategories, but overall with our presentation, what I will be covering here today is mainly going to be focused on the recommendations that were most common and represent the majority of the recommendations that we've seen from the evaluations. And in our reference doc, we do provide a bit more detail into the recommendations. So if we can continue to the next slide. All right, and so for each of these slides that I'm going to be going over, what I'm going to do, I will be covering essentially some of the larger recommendations or ones that are potentially interest. If at any point you have questions, feel free to stop me and let me know, and I'll be happy to answer any questions regarding any of these recommendations that we've seen, and I'll try to provide as much context as possible. But for the first slide that we're going to go over here, it's regarding governance. For the majority of the recommendations, they were around the idea or recommendation of having the systems conduct annual reviews and reviewing their procedures that work to independently verify aspects, such as the system performance, their providers, and their consultants. And so an example of this is that there were recommendations or where an evaluator identified that a plan was essentially verifying their services and fees from their investment consultant by periodically soliciting RFPs. And this sort of ties the two first points together, reviewing the IPS and issuing RFPs every 3 to 5 years. As issuing RFPs every 3 to 5 years was identified as a best practice by evaluators and a recommendation to continue or to do that. So what we were seeing is that there was a recommendation regarding the need to continue to review the system's performance, and using those RFPs was a great way to verify, or as a tool to independently verify that their investment consultants' fees are in line with industry standards or with their peers. Now, the other one that I think—
Keith, did you have excuse me, Robert. Keith, did you have a question that you wanted to ask at this time?
I do. Thank you, Chris. Robert, is it fair to infer that if a fund is making a recommendation, such as reviewing the investment policy statement or system performance at least annually, that fund is not doing that now?
Not necessarily. There were a number of recommendations that were made by the evaluators to where they would essentially say the system is doing this, it's recommended that they keep doing the practice. Now, that's not to say that there were definitely evaluations to where the evaluator did call out that the system had not reviewed it or made an update to the IPS in a number of years. But that's not to say for all the recommendations. There were definitely recommendations that were made that the system was doing it, but the evaluator was just calling out the importance of continuing to do that practice.
Thank you.
Okay. So then, and this sort of goes into the next one is sort of similar. So one of the recommendations here that we saw was a recommendation for developing a written governance policy, right? So for this particular recommendation, and this is going to be sort of a topic and theme that we see throughout a number of these recommendations, is a need for documentation and having things clearly written out, is that for this particular recommendation, the systems that were identified for needing to develop a written governance policy, it was that they already had certain procedures or roles and responsibilities that were outlined somewhat in the IPS regarding the governance policies. However, they did not have a clearly outlined governance policy in the IPS. So it was a need from the evaluators that they identified that they could improve by more thoroughly documenting the various policies that should be there for governance, and just taking what they're already doing, as they were identified as essentially doing what's needed for the governance, but just documenting it better in the IPS was essentially the recommendations there. And then just real quickly here, touching on sort of the remaining 2 points for transparency and training. For transparency, these recommendations, they were somewhat general. And what I mean by that is they were just recommendations around add more documents to your website, provide more of that information, or update the website. And, now with COVID, having more information online is definitely a good thing. And for improving the trustee training improvements, those were just, again, some general recommendations around making sure that the training material stays up to date. Though one interesting one I think is important as well that plans consider is there was a recommendation for having a more robust onboarding training process, as becoming a new trustee, a good onboarding process and training materials can be incredibly useful to any new trustees. I think that's something that plans can definitely take away. But unless there's no questions, we can go on to the next slide. So for the next one here, this is for the manager selection monitoring. For this, the big theme and where a lot of these recommendations were made, and there was some variations as to what they were saying, but they were ultimately mainly concerning the criteria around hiring, firing, and reviewing the investment managers. And as generally plans are reliant on the support and expertise from their investment consultants, the investment consultants have, and were usually outlined and detailed by the evaluations to have very detailed processes or procedures in place for these various topics. But those essential procedures that the investment consultant has were not documented well by the plan in their IPS. So they're using the expertise of their consultants, but they were not having the same level of detail regarding these processes and the IPS themselves for the systems. So that was one of the key things that was identified for improving the criteria that was listed and provided in the IPS regarding those topics around the hiring, firing, and reviewing the managers, and some of the details around performance reviews and things of that nature. And one of these recommendations I do just want to touch on is there was a recommendation for adding a conflict of interest policy. And so this was a recommendation from an evaluator to where they were recommending that there be a conflict of interest policy specifically for the trustees and any potential conflict of interest there whenever they're selecting investment managers. But other than that, for these recommendations here, they were all, again, concerning that hiring, firing, and reviewing process, and just providing more clarity on what that process is and what are the details and considerations that should go into them, and such as including net and gross of fee returns relative to benchmarks and peers, providing those specific criteria. And then there were some very general various topics as well. Again, there was a variety of these regarding just some very specific plan edits, and they were a lot more just specific to the plans themselves as to what language they had in the IPS and just making some slight adjustments there. But if there's no questions, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so for the investment fees, for this one, I first want to start with looking at the recommendations here that were made for and concerning the passive investments. So there were a number of recommendations that were made regarding plans should be considering either including passive investments or increasing their passive investment exposure, as it can be a great tool for fee reduction. And one of the evaluators, and I think it was a good thing that they used, was they provided an example from the Greenwich Associates 2018 institutional survey, where they found that plans with 1 to 5 billion in assets had on average 18% of their total portfolio in passive investments. And so they were using that resource, and it's one of the resources that we're compiling here, and I'll touch on it a little bit later. But essentially using those additional resources to help provide some clarity as to things that plans should consider. And I think it's a very useful thing that plans should take away from that, and looking at various resources to see what are some things that they can do to help reduce those fees, such as inclusion or increasing passive investment exposure. The next one, oh, we have a question.
I just had a question since you're talking about resources. Are you also looking at what fund are doing in these areas? I know you have a lot of information just here to compile, so I was just curious, that's all.
You broke up a little bit there for the question. If you can please repeat.
Okay, my question was, are you also looking at what Texas Treasury, Permanent School Fund, and UTIMCO are doing with respect to these areas? My comment is, I know you have a lot of information right here. You just had mentioned other outside resources. That's why I asked.
So for those ones, for this particular aspect, we haven't been looking at those particularly. The main resources that we'll compile, and I'll touch on a little bit later, have been the ones that were specifically identified by the evaluators in these evaluations as what they've deemed as useful resources or that they're using. So we'll get to a slide for that and just a little bit here. But for that question, no, we haven't been specifically looking at those yet. Well, it's definitely something that we can look at as well. But then continuing, so one of the next recommendations that came up in this area was regarding benchmarking fees, and some of the most common approaches and recommendations that were made were essentially around the plans using and comparing their fees against their peers and appropriate peer groups, as well as industry standards. And this was from the ones that were identified were averages pulled from the NCPERS study, as well as the Public Pension Plan Database, or the consultants themselves using their internal knowledge that they have from other various clients of similar sizes. So those were examples of some of the recommendations that were made for including or having more of those benchmarks included in regards to investment fee review. And then the next biggest one that I want to touch on here is, and again, it's a theme that we've been seeing, is a need for documentation. And this is more specifically to documentation and reconciliation of fees paid. So there were a number of recommendations that were made for improving that documentation process and what fees should be documented. And this is in regards to, as an example, fees such as the investment management fees netted from returns, carried interest, or other expenses related to cash or real estate. And the evaluators were calling this out because they were essentially stating and saying that, right, having these additional fees and everything well documented helps and allows the plans to conduct, annual reviews, and having this information allows them to have better oversight over the investment fees when comparing to those benchmarks that were also being called out, right? Looking at their peers or industry standards. So having those additional fees documented is incredibly important to improving that process. And so that was, again, one of the bigger ones that were called out there in relation to the benchmarking and the fees in general. So with that, if there are no other comments or questions, we can move on. And so for this one, for this slide here, this slide and category that we have was generally our catch-all category. So these were essentially some recommendations that were just general improvements maybe to the IPS or would cross a number of categories. So again, this is just sort of our catch-all. But the first one that recommendations I do want to touch on, and it relates back to the investment fees and that need for documentation, is that there were a number of recommendations for improving the definitions as to what the roles and responsibilities are for a number of positions or aspects. And the top one that came up was fee review and reporting, that there was a need for further defining who is responsible for those aspects and what is included with that, what are the type of material that's required for the reporting. And also there were calls for further defining the investment consultant's role. And generally, when those recommendations were made regarding the fee review and reporting or the investment consultant, they were usually together, or regarding the review process, as typically the investment consultant would be one of the experts that's helping the plans and the systems review those fees and helping them get the information that they need there. So that was one of the big things that was being called out, a need to, again, further define and explicitly state who's responsible for this and what are the requirements that we're looking for. So that was a big one here for that. And then the remaining recommendations were just very general recommendations for improving the investment policy. So very general stuff as far as recommendations for including a discussion on, say, risk in the IPS, or making slight language adjustments to how they're describing a asset class, or just moving around a table in the IPS. So just very general recommendations as far as just slight improvements. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. For the asset allocation, the big one here that we saw for the asset allocation recommendations was, again, a need for some documentation here regarding some of their processes and procedures that they were doing. One of the big ones was for documenting their existing practices for determining and evaluating the asset allocation. And as an example of what that was, is there were some plans that identified by the evaluator that they were doing already a number of practices and procedures that were resulting in a well-diversified asset allocation, but they did not have some aspects that this evaluation was looking for. So an example of that is that the IPS was lacking certain areas such as information on the capital market assumptions or cash flow and liquidity needs for the plan. So there wasn't discussion or information regarding that. And from my recollection, for the majority of the recommendations that were made regarding this, the plans did take action and were noted by the evaluator to have taken those actions and have been updating or are going to update the IPS to include those topics. Now, the next sort of big thing here that I want to mention, because I think it's important now, was there was a recommendation made by an evaluator for essentially avoiding large changes in the strategic asset allocation too frequently. And sort of what that was is the evaluator was mentioning that if the plans are making large asset allocations, they should not feel rushed to change the investments quickly. They should take the time to methodically rebalance the portfolio to the new asset allocation if they're making one, and that they shouldn't feel a need to rush that change, as well as with the markets being how they are right now with the large amounts of volatility, right? Taking your time is crucial here. Don't make any rash decisions. As well as if you're reviewing the asset allocation, understand that generally asset allocations for large institutional plans typically stay about where they are for about 3 to 5 years. So don't feel the need to be rushed. I think that's important, something that plans should consider if they're reviewing the asset allocations, not to feel the need to be rushed with making changes to anything or to transition the plan to a new asset allocation. But Other than that, there were just some various general recommendations that were made for, again, improving some documentation of just some language policies and making some slight improvements as to defining various aspects. Okay, if we want to go ahead and continue. And so this is the final slide that we have for the recommendations of what we're covering today. So for this, I sort of want to touch on a couple of the recommendations together. So this is going to be concerning the recommendations regarding the liquidity and cash flow concerns. So there were a number of recommendations that were made concerning the contribution levels and or the negative non-investment cash flow concerns. So these were plans that were or had conducted a asset liability study and were looking at the impact of contribution levels not being sufficient enough to support the plan, and right, what was the ultimate impact on the plan's assets. And I think, again, that's something that's can be very useful for plans to do, and that was identified by the evaluators, especially now when we're seeing that sponsors may not be able to meet or have revenues decline from the impact of COVID. Having those type of conversations or studies done for asset liabilities, looking at the potential impact there from those contribution levels maybe not being where they need to be, is incredibly useful, as it allows plans to get an idea of how they can help negate that and what are things that they need to do now to try to avoid any issues. So again, those were some of the big ones that we saw coming up was recommendations or concerns around that. And those were, again, driven by plans doing those asset liability studies and the evaluators looking at that. So I think it's great that the evaluators were looking and thinking about that, especially with how that impacts us now. But then other than that, again, there were just some very general recommendations regarding some aspects of just overall policy language and improvements that could be made by the evaluators. So with that, that'll ultimately cover the recommendations here that we are going to be covering here today and what we've seen. But real quickly, just to summarize what we've discussed and sort of what are the main takeaways here. Plans should ultimately review, right, their IPS and various core sections annually. And when reviewing these practices, they should consider ensuring that those practices, procedures, their roles and responsibilities, the fee monitoring, and the overall investment manager hiring, firing, and review process are all well documented and defined. And properly documenting and defining these topics is incredibly important now, and in two ways. One, to ultimately help the next trustee in the future, but now with these challenging times, with the impact of COVID and uncertainty there, having a well-documented, defined practice is key to having a solid foundation for managing these plans. And with that being a core thing that we've seen across these recommendations, from a need to further define and clarify certain aspects, and just having it written down is, I think, incredibly important. And one of the biggest takeaways that we've seen across these recommendations is a further need to clarify and document and put that down in writing what they're doing, because the evaluators are calling them out and saying that they're doing a good job. They have procedures in place. They just need to make sure that they're documenting that and improving on that clarity there. So with that, question.
Mr. Chairman, if I might ask a question, please.
Robert, please do.
Thank you. Robert, thank you. Did you get a sense from reviewing these reports as to whether or not there are funds out there, and if so, how many that don't have an investment policy?
So from my recollection here, I don't believe that there were any that were evaluated that did not have an investment policy statement. I believe every single one had an IPS. If there were recommendations for improvements, it was generally around some of those subsection topics that needed to provide additional clarity and information. But to my recollection, every single evaluation so far has said that they have an IPS.
Thank you.
Mr. Brenner, this is Kenny Herbold, Staff Actuary. I will note that there has been a requirement in government statute for all plans to have a written IPS for quite a number of years. So that is already a requirement that every single plan, regardless of plan size, is required to have a written IPS. It's more along the lines of the details that are required to be included that these are addressing, I think, that the recommendations are addressing.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Shivers, go ahead.
Shivers. I had a question. Are you going to talk about the variation and robustness of responses? Or you talk about that later or in general? I just had a question about that.
This is Kenny again. Yeah, I'm going to cover that in a little bit later section of the presentation.
Any other questions for Robert before we advance? Okay.
All right. Yep. So this will be the last slide here that I will present. So as I mentioned earlier, Sherry, we do have some standards, benchmarks, and resources that were identified by the evaluators. And this is part of what we're compiling so far. And we are working to compile a full list of all of these resources and standards, providing some descriptions, and we'll ultimately look to provide a sort of resource document to plans that will be made available to plans, as we think that these resources can be incredibly useful as they're being mentioned and called out by these evaluators with their expertise, that these are useful. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to complete that full list and get that out to plans. And I mean, we do appreciate and that the evaluators were clearly defining these resources and standards, as from this evaluation process, just having this can be incredibly useful to plans if they're looking for ways to improve, right, or find various resources. So I think that's incredibly useful, and definitely something that we will be looking to get out to the plans as soon as possible. But with that, that'll conclude my section of the presentation here.
Thank you, Robert. Any other questions for Robert before he passes to Kenny? Kenny?
Thank you, committee members. Again, my name is Kenny Herbold. I'm the staff actuary at the PRB. My intent is kind of talk about where we go from here. So, you know, Robert has provided a summary of some of the information we have gleaned from the evaluations that we've had an opportunity to review. You know, I do want to note that you know, the recommendations and the analysis that we have seen, there's quite a bit of extremely useful information that I think that the systems themselves can get from these evaluations. There's a number of explanations included within the evaluations that help not just the system trustees, but other stakeholders to get a better understanding of what their board and the board's consultants are doing. So there has been a lot of, I think, extremely useful information that's been shared within a number of these valuations. So where we go from here basically is we are, as the PRB, have been directed to produce an investment performance report that we will present to the legislature. And that report is supposed to compile and summarize the information received. So just to give you a quick rundown of the timeline of that, obviously today we're presenting a preliminary report of what we've seen. And please keep in mind that this is just the initial pass through some of them. So we will continue to analyze the evaluations, both the ones that we have gone through already, as well as the ones that we have not had a chance to review completely yet. We plan to present a more thorough analysis at the September 29 Investment Committee meeting, and that's going to culminate in a draft of the investment performance report presented to the board in November that then will be passed along once it's approved by the board will be passed along to the legislature in our biennial report. So as we prepare that analysis, staff is seeking guidance from committee members on any analysis or any specific items that you believe should be included in this report. But first, I do want to give you a better sense of the variation that we're seeing in these reports and what it is that we're seeing in the evaluation so far. So the statute does contemplate that the evaluations are going to be conducted by experts who have substantial experience performing this type of work. And because of that, we expected to see quite a bit of variation in the reports as those experts rely on that expertise to develop something that they believe is appropriate. And we've seen quite a bit of variation in the evaluations that we've received. And again, I will say that there's been a decent number that have lots of really good explanation that talk about the analysis that they're performing. So beyond the recommendations that Robert has summarized, beyond the resources that we've identified that each of these evaluations are utilizing and have indicated are good benchmarks or good resources to rely on, different industry standards that they're comparing against. Basically, our goal is to identify what additional information needs to be communicated to the legislature about these evaluations and what we're seeing. So staff, what we've done is first we're looking to our understanding of the intent of the law. So we understand that two of the key goals of this law is to increase transparency as well as strengthen oversight of investment-related decisions. Now, one thing I do want to note that Robert kind of pointed out during his presentation is that there was a theme that kind of ran throughout the recommendations, regardless of how we categorize them, which grouping we put them in. There was an emphasis on additional documentation or clarification of documentation of existing policies so that everyone has a better understanding of both who is performing specific activities as well as how those activities are supposed to occur. And finally, we referenced the informal guidance that the board published in October of 2019, and on page 28, we've included some of that. And so we're looking to the 5 elements that the board identified as items that were expected to be included in a thorough evaluation. So keeping these 3 things in mind, basically that both transparency and a strengthening oversight. The evaluations themselves did focus on documentation and making sure that everyone who needed to know had a better understanding of how things are being processed, and then also the guidance and these 5 elements that the board identified. Staff has essentially been viewing the evaluations and reviewing the evaluations from the perspective of how useful the reports will be to all stakeholders. But in particular, we're kind of focused on how useful they are to the stakeholders such as plan members who are not familiar with the board's governance practices or don't have the expertise to evaluate the practices themselves. So with that in mind, what we've done is we have provided a couple of sample evaluations, a handful of sections, starting on page 35 of the packet. And actually, if you actually want to go to page 68, I really kind of wanted to point to one in specific. So we've provided 4 different firms, different evaluations that have different approaches to how they have performed the evaluation, as well as how they have communicated the information. Right, and we feel that each of these evaluations has done a fairly good job of including the 5 elements that were identified in the informal guidance, as well as providing a lot of transparency and a lot of useful information that their stakeholders can use. And so one reason I wanted to point out this one in particular is because it literally starts off this section with an explanation of what they've called a primer on investment manager selection. So they are laying out this is how we believe investment manager selection should occur. So they are providing a significant amount of education to not just the existing trustees, but any other stakeholder who picks up this report can get a better understanding. And they walk through this and say, this is how it should occur. This is what the board is currently doing. And then talk about the differences between those two things, talk about how the board itself can, what it's doing well and how they can make improvements. So it provides a whole lot of information to all the stakeholders, not just those who already know how the board makes their decisions and engages in all of the various things that they're required to do. So actually, if you can go back to, I believe it's page 28. So again, as Ms. Shivers asked earlier, to elaborate a little bit on the variety. So we have seen a number of evaluations that communicate what's occurring and communicate how the evaluators themselves are comparing these against the industry best practices, as well as how they are drawing their conclusions. So the stakeholders can understand this is what the board themselves are doing well, this is what where they can make improvements. Now, as Robert noted earlier in his presentation, more than half of the evaluations that we have reviewed have not included any specific recommendations, and so we're not calling that out to say that a lack of recommendations alone should necessarily be considered an issue, because there are a number of evaluations who have not specifically made recommendations for those plans, but have provided a thorough explanation of why they don't think that improvement is necessary, right? So they've provided a thorough explanation that explains this is how this particular process should occur. This is how, again, just like the example I showed a minute ago, how the board itself is engaging in this particular process and why it meets the necessary requirements and how they're doing things well. It is a situation where that level of explanation from the outside, you don't have the ability to pick up the report and gain a better understanding. And a number of the evaluations will provide detail on the actions that are being taken. And so for someone who is familiar with industry best practices, or who is familiar with what is most appropriate in those situations, they might be able to come to the same conclusion as the evaluators. It is the reports that don't document and identify the process that the evaluators followed. So similar to item number 5 in the informal guidance, if there isn't an explanation associated with why the evaluator believes that these particular policies meet best practice, it's difficult for a new board member stepping onto the board to understand exactly what they're doing well and what and why, or for a plan member to have a better understanding of how their how their board is making investment decisions. And I'm happy to take any questions on what we're seeing.
Kenny, this is Christopher Zook. So what I want to maybe rephrase and see if what I heard you say is accurate. So in essence, the purpose of this document is to evaluate and provide recommendations. And it's okay if there's no new recommendations, as long as they explain why there's no need for new recommendations, and that what's being done now is best practice. And what I heard you say is that it's not just for the current board, which is where obviously a lot of these are written kind of directed towards, but more about who's next, what future board members are going to come in, obviously for this committee and for this board, obviously for the legislators, and then as well for the stakeholders of that particular plan. So, you know, it's okay to not make recommendations, but it's not okay if they don't explain why what they're doing right now is very good. Is that what I heard you say?
I mean, I think that is generally accurate. What we are, the lens that we are looking through at this through is how useful are these? Are they going to? So this is an opportunity, right, to increase transparency, and many of the processes that these boards follow are contained within the IPS or within other documents that people have access to. But understanding why those are the best approach for the given governance structure, why those are the way in which the board and their consultants make their decisions is not necessarily clear to someone who does not have the expertise to make that evaluation. And so as we reviewed and compared the various evaluations, what stood out and what seemed to provide the most transparency and enable not just the PRB, but other stakeholders to engage in oversight of how their own benefits are managed or investment decisions are made, is that additional explanation that provides the understanding to those individuals as to why that makes sense. And so that's why we are distinguishing between the two types.
And I think it's something that we all ought to be very, you know, obvious about and aware of. It's, you know, this is the first time that we've asked for these reports. This is the first time that most of these plans have completed anything similar to this. So we recognize that there's enormous dispersion between the way someone interpreted the intent and another person might have interpreted the intent. And so I think we can kind of help guide this process, and it's a good opportunity to develop kind of a standardized methodology. What I would ask is that, you know, is that staff, you know, where we did get evaluations, and we know there was big dispersion, where we got evaluations that were really not substantive, they didn't really provide a lot of analysis or discussion, you know, can we reach out to those plans and just kind of help them see, you know, the difference between some of the examples that we had today and what we got from them, and help kind of help them shape, you know, their responses to this required report under the statute? Can we do that?
Yes, I believe we can. So we have already had some conversations with some of the systems and their consultants, and we can certainly continue to have those conversations. So I believe one of the goals here is to identify where improvements can be made, and obviously you are absolutely correct. This was the first time out, and it was done in over a relatively short period of time. And so I think that my impression of having spoken to some of these systems and their consultants is that they are looking for a better understanding of what we think should be included in them and how useful they are. And they're all more than willing to make those improvements as needed.
That's great. Other questions for Kenny? Mr. Briner?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to take this discussion a step further, and that is with respect to possible improvements to this statute, suggest that in addition to the requirement that funds identify recommendations, the statute might better say that in addition to or instead of recommendations, and particularly in cases where there are no recommendations, that the fund be required to demonstrate that their policy and procedures are working. So that it would read, tell us your recommendations and/or demonstrate that your policies are working.
It's a great suggestion. And as we move forward to the preparation of the report to the legislature, I think that would be something that can be included in that based on feedback from staff and obviously from the full board. So thank you for that. Any other questions or comments for Kenny?
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of others. Sorry, Sherry.
Please, please.
You know, one thing that's not clear to me, and I think the legislation, this is a result of the statute, and that is, it's not clear to me whether these are reports from the investment consultant or these are reports from the retirement systems, the boards. And reading over the material that has been made available to us, I don't have any assurance that the retirement system board members have seen these reports, much less signed off on them. And I think an improvement in this statute could and should be that the board has signed off on it and verified that the board has seen and signed off on it to the Pension Review Board.
So based on the way the law is written, the board itself is required to select the firm to perform the evaluation. So there's no guarantee that they are involved in the development of how the analysis is conducted, but I think that generally speaking, when they select a firm to do this, there is discussion of how that occurs. And I believe, and I'm looking, I apologize for not having this at my fingertips, but I believe that the report, there it is. The report is required to be filed with the governing body of the public retirement system. So the firm that is completing the evaluation must submit the evaluation to the governing body, so to the board that oversees that particular retirement system. And then the board itself is responsible for submitting the report to the Pension Review Board. And so if you're looking for that specifically, it's 802.109F is where that specific item is included. And based on how we generally receive this information, it comes through a representative of the board. We do not generally receive the reports directly from any of the evaluating firms.
That's good to know.
Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, please. That's just good to know that they are the ones submitting it. And I think best practices would be for staff, if they receive it directly from a third-party consultant, to, insist gently that it come from the board itself. Thereby, we know they are the ones that have submitted it to our group.
Yeah. I'm looking for some pretty solid assurance that the board has seen this and has signed off on it and knows about it. Because as I said, as far as I can tell, this is a product of the investment consultant. And Kenny, if you're telling us that the board has seen it, that's good to know. But honestly, I'd like the board to be on record as saying, yeah, we've seen this and we are sending this off to the PRB with full knowledge and understanding of what it says.
So in your understanding, Kenny, of the statute, does it require, and/or is it something to where you've seen them as they've come in, that they are actually signed, and acknowledged by the board itself, whether it be by an authorized signatory or the entire board themselves?
I would say it's a mix. Some of the reports that we have received have included a cover letter from a representative of the board in addition to a copy of the report, and some we have received an email from the board or a representative of the board indicating that they are submitting a copy of the report to us. So there is no.
It sounds like, yeah, it sounds like with what Mr. Brainerd is looking for, which might be, you know, best codified in statute, would be that the board has acknowledged that they have reviewed and that they have signed and that they have submitted this as a group. Thereby, there's more substantiation that they have actually reviewed it if they're going to put their signature associated with it. Mr. Brainerd, is that consistent with what you're hoping for?
Mr. Chairman, you articulated it better than I do, and yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Members, Anumeha Kumar, Executive Director. Quickly to add to this conversation, we were encouraged in a few evaluations that we received that did include recommendations. We were encouraged to see that in few of those, it was mentioned that the board has already or is in the process of implementing those recommendations. So in those cases, we had more assurance that the board was more involved in completing the evaluation, reviewing the evaluation, and before sending it to us.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just have one other point, and I'll cede the
Please.
floor. And that is, I would like my fellow committee members and the full board to consider one other addition to the requirements, and that's something that came up during our discussion today, and that is identification in future reports of the percentage of portfolios that are actively managed versus passively managed.
That should be an easy suggestion that should be easy to implement, I would think.
Thank you, and that's all that I have. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Brainerd. Ms. Shivers, it's hard on video. Did I see your hand? Did you have a comment or a question?
Yes, I want to echo my support for the recommendations that have been made. I think the board acknowledgement can be as simple as a signature page. The second thing is that I also want to support reaching out to the systems informally. I really like that idea, so it's not a gotcha for them. And third, I want to commend the staff on going through all this information, which was in such various forms that really made it difficult to go through. And I think they have done a good job on this first pass.
No, I would 100% echo that. The staff has done a massive lift in this particular case, just because A, it's not a standardized form. B, there's so many different folks that are involved in it. So I commend, Robert and Kenny and the rest of the staff for their work on this. Couple of comments that I have related to this, as somebody who makes investment decisions every single day and hires and fires managers and looks at this from the lens of an investor. Just a couple of things that I would add to the discussion in general, one of which is a fairly direct one. There's no way to eliminate conflicts of interest entirely in this world, but where conflicts of interest do exist, we need to recognize them and be sure that we're comfortable with what those conflicts are. And so for all of the systems who had their active consultant produce this report, it's okay to do that. But it's also important that the systems and that the board of those systems understand that those consultants are not likely to say that anything they're doing is wrong. It would be not in their best interest to do that. So it's not a coincidence in my mind that the independent third parties that produce these reports obviously had lots of recommendations, and that less of those that are the active consultant that did these had recommendations for changes, because it doesn't look good for them if they have suggested that there should have been something done that they hadn't been doing. So the fact that that conflict exists is okay. And we recognize that for some plans that it's more expensive to go out and get a third-party independent consultant to do these reports. And for the smaller plans, it becomes even more significant of a burden. And so what we want to be sure is that the boards and that the stakeholders of these systems understand and hold the consultants who are active consultants producing the reports to an extremely high standard of, we're not trying to get anybody in trouble here. We just want to make sure we're doing best practices. And one of the things that I think really, was articulated earlier, I'm going to articulate slightly differently. The whole purpose of this statute is to provide helpful analysis for the board itself, for the pension board, for the pensioners themselves, the stakeholders, the PRB, and also for the legislators. So the more education that's produced in these, the better it is for everybody, because it's not just about the current board. It's also about those that are going to be coming down the road, and also for the stakeholders who are not sitting in those meetings going through all of those difficult decisions. And so if we look at this as an opportunity, as a really, really good opportunity to where this is a shared knowledge base that's accessible very easily by all the plans, that's a really big value. I mean, I can tell you as an investment professional, knowing what best practices are from 20 different firms of how they go about doing things, and then being able to identify where an organization can improve, I mean, there's enormous value to that, and usually it cannot be received because of competitive reasons. In this particular world, it's a complete open playbook of here's what success can look like, here's how decisions are made, and what it can do is actually allow the operation of this board, of this pension, of this system to become more machine-like, that persists throughout time and is excellent in implementing best practices, which should translate to obviously better performance and overall net improvements for the people that we're trying to provide benefits for. So I do want to just say that I know that it was a very hotly contested issue when the legislature, passed this. And I really want to commend them for doing that, because it really is going to strengthen the overall ability to honor the commitments that each of these systems have made to all of their stakeholders, whether it be the taxpayers, whether it be, the current employees or the retirees of these systems. And it's a huge step. And if we will look at this as an evolving process to where we can keep getting better every time we do it, I think it's going to add, tremendous impact to the lives of all those, that are involved. So that's kind of where I would close it on the discussion of the reports themselves. I know I'm trying to remember from the next section. Do we have more to cover in this before we move on to topic 6?
I think that's...
Because I've got a couple other comments. Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you. But the thing that I heard throughout the commentary from Mr. Brainerd and Ms. Shivers and kind of the back and forth is, we have a meeting coming up on the 29th of September. It's likely to be at around 10 a.m. And what I would ask staff to do is to come back to us by the next meeting with the top 5 priorities of what the staff would recommend that we discuss with the legislature about continuing to strengthen this section of the statute and implement some of the things that we've talked about. I know we've talked about a couple, and I know that staff probably has others that y'all would recommend as you continue to get through the rest of the reports that are still yet to come. So I'd ask y'all to do that between now and the next session, next meeting of this committee. Okay, with that, we're going to go to public comment. Obviously, there was no pre-registered attendees. Does anyone else in the audience have any comments that you'd like to present to the committee? You'll need to hit *6 in order to be able to unmute yourself and come back to and make your comment. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes. So please share with us if you would like to do so. Okay. So I want to reiterate what Ms. Shivers said. I mean, this is a huge lift for the staff, and y'all have done an excellent job in getting all of this put together in a way that's easy for us to digest it. And so thank you for that effort, and we know that it's going to continue between now and the next meeting in September. If there's no further business and no objection, then the chair moves to adjourn this meeting. Is there a second?
Sherry Shivers, second.
Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you to everyone for participating.